Troutman Sanders and Pepper Hamilton have been producing podcasts focused on issues across all of our practice groups that clients will face as they move through reopening and returning to work. Today's podcast will focus on issues regarding reopening commercial buildings. We will discuss some considerations for both landlords and tenants as we start to go back to work in this new normal. Our panel today consists of Gary Knopf, real estate partner with Troutman Sanders, and Hannah Dowd McPhelin, real estate partner with Pepper Hamilton. Gary and Hannah are joined by Lisa Mize, Senior Vice President of Property Management and Construction Services for Shorenstein, who will provide a landlord's perspective on reopening. And now I'll turn it over to Hannah to start the conversation.
Thanks, Julia. Gary, it's great to be here with you today to talk about what everyone is talking about these days, reopening. What are some considerations that you think landlords should be thinking about when reopening their buildings?
Thanks, Hannah. It's good to be talking about reopening, and we all, I'm sure, hope to be going back to work pretty soon. So I think there are sort of several important considerations to think about. The first being government restrictions. As you know, there are several executive orders across pretty much almost all states that dictate how businesses can reopen, depending on what the types of businesses are. Even some states are requiring preparedness plans. In Georgia, for example, the latest executive order out of the governor's office has several requirements regarding implementing measures to mitigate the exposure and spread for non-essential businesses, and they have different categories for critical infrastructure and non-critical infrastructure. And for non-critical infrastructure, they have almost 21 requirements for businesses to follow. And I think what's important for landlords to think about is really just following guidelines from the CDC, the WHO, and the local government agencies. In particular, so just thought I would give an example of things that Georgia is requiring. Disinfecting common surfaces regularly, requiring businesses to have hand hygiene stations, enforcing social distancing requirements, posting signs and notices, the notices being, if you're sick, stay home, enhancing social distancing guidelines. So, and there's a host of other requirements and things for businesses to consider, even coming down to screening employees for temperatures in some respects. And so why is this important for landlords? So I think it's important for landlords because for most office buildings and most commercial properties, the landlords really should be focusing on the common areas. That's where they control. And from a legal liability standpoint, that's, a lot of times, depending on bargaining power, landlords are required to even indemnify tenants to the extent harm is caused in the common areas. So it's really important for landlords to start focusing on, how they can control the common areas and how they can give notices to tenants on common areas and things to do in the common areas. So a couple things to consider here for landlords, posting signage. And we're going to hear from Shorenstein, our client, and our friend Lisa, who's going to talk to us about some specific things they're doing in buildings across the country. And, signage, posting signage so that in the common areas, the tenants can see exactly how they should navigate the common areas, what's going to be closed in the common areas. Enhanced cleaning, they should consider closing down large meeting areas, cafeterias, seating areas, putting hand sanitizer stations, controlling elevators, controlling the access to the elevators and numbers of people in the elevators to the extent that's practical. So that's kind of a generality of what landlords should consider. Hannah, do you want to talk a little bit about what tenants might want to consider?
Sure, absolutely. I think a lot of tenants' concerns are very similar to some of the ones you just named for landlords. This is really a great opportunity for landlords and tenants to cooperate, to get together, to have lots of discussions, because I really think that's going to be necessary in most multi-tenant buildings in order to get them up and running and make sure that everybody's on the same page and that they can do so safely. And we're already seeing a wide range of landlord responses. So I think on one end of the spectrum, you have companies like Lisa's who are taking a very thoughtful, comprehensive approach. And we've actually already seen with some of our clients who have landlords who've basically said, you're on your own. We're worried about liability. We don't want anything to do with this. But obviously, they need to run the building. And so it's really more helpful if everybody can kind of get to the table, talk about their concerns, how they operate, and figure out how to go forward. Some of the things that you talked about, Gary, in the operational issues in multi-tenant buildings, just getting people in and out of the building and how to do that safely. What if there's a positive test by either a visitor to the building or an employee who works in the building? What happens then? Is the floor shut down and people have to quarantine? Does the building shut down? Just, again, making sure that there's some policy in place so everybody's expectations are set and they know what they have to do to go forward if various things happen. Obviously, the cleaning is a big concern for common areas, and then also within tenant spaces where you have landlords that are providing that janitorial service. So again, the parties really need to work together. It's not going to be a quick process or a quick discussion, but as some yard signs in my neighborhood say, we're all in this together, so it's better if we all figure it out. And I do think landlords will have to be sensitive to some tenants' internal procedures. So, for example, our firms have come up with their own set of policies, what they need in their various lease spaces in order to reopen. That may or may not line up exactly with what each of our landlords are planning for the building. So there's been a whole series of discussions that are happening, and I don't think we're unique in that, to try and figure out how to bring those two procedures together. It reminds me a little bit of when landlords were first implementing sustainability standards or procedures for buildings, where you'd have the building recycling program that maybe didn't quite mesh with what the tenant's internal recycling program or policy for confidential materials being shredded might be, and we had to have discussions to figure out where there was a comfortable meeting place for everybody. And obviously the concern around COVID is much more heightened than that, so the discussions are that much more important. We also have to think about the costs, and I think a lot of tenants are thinking about the costs. The cost of the landlord response, whatever measures the landlords are putting in place, who's going to pay for them, right? So obviously enhanced cleaning is going to cost more. If a landlord's handing out masks, for instance, if they're having somebody check temperatures, new signage that tells everybody which way to go, how many people in the elevator, where to stand. So all of those things have a cost attached to them. I do suspect that most leases where costs are being passed through to tenants through operating expenses, likely that operating expense definition that may cover a lot of these things and allow pass-throughs, but it's something for landlords and tenants to think about and to get their arms around what those costs might be. So generally, our existing leases are going to need to stretch a little bit in ways that, to be honest, none of us probably ever anticipated, to think about some of these new measures. I wouldn't be surprised to start seeing new and updated rules and regulations exhibits. I think a lot of the things we're talking about, these operational issues and how people move around a building, could really be captured in that type of document. And sometimes the landlord will also have a catch-all in a lease that allows it to implement measures in the building for tenants' health and safety. And that seems to have been made really for this situation. So I think we might see landlords start to invoke that as well.
That's great. Thanks. One thing that I was considering and thinking about landlords focus on the common areas and things they're doing to implement certain procedures in the building. So how do we give tenants notice of certain aspects of that? So is it, do you think that it's best to utilize the notice procedures in the lease? Obviously, the lease will obviously dictate what notices are required. But the other thing to consider is landlords oftentimes have access rights to premises in certain circumstances. So landlords may want to consider whether they should use those access rights to access the premises, to put signage up and other materials to make sure that the tenants are actually giving out to their employees the information, so the employees themselves know how to access the parking garage, how to access the parking elevators. And as you said, tenants and landlords really need to work together in this process. So we'd love to bring in Lisa to the conversation. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it's really, we're excited to hear exactly what Shorenstein has been doing. So what are you seeing that landlords are doing in practice at this point?
So, well, first and foremost, I agree with you. We have to, this is a joint operation, right? It's not property management or tenants. We do have to work together. I think we also need to remember that there are a lot of people coming back to the buildings who are concerned for their health and for their lives, honestly. And, so many people have been under stay-at-home orders, with the idea that, it's really not safe to go out in public. And so now all of a sudden, we're talking about going back in public. And, I think a lot of people are really understandably concerned about that. So, the person that we deal with at our tenants might not be one of those people, but, we do recognize that the person we deal with is dealing with a whole office full of people that may be tremendously concerned. So, we obviously need to acknowledge the stress and the uncertainty that people are experiencing right now, and think about things that we can do realistically to minimize the risk, but also things that we can do to help our tenants feel comfortable and secure coming back into the buildings. So you touched on a bunch of different things in your opening remarks, and my mind's going in a million different directions because this has been all-consuming for us, frankly, for the past 3 months. But from a landlord perspective, I think that collectively the world of commercial real estate landlords are generally doing a lot of the same things, and so I want to answer the question in a couple different big buckets, if I can, that will touch on a lot of what you're talking about. So communicating, education and social distancing, going touchless, it's a big point of conversation, elevators, and how we're controlling entry to our properties. So from a communications perspective, we're all communicating with each other. We're all chatting with one another. So, this is definitely not a who's doing it better. So we're talking with our peers in the real estate industry. We're talking with our industry advocates like BOMA and Real Estate Roundtable. We are having a lot of conversations with our tenants about what's important to them and what they're thinking about. A lot of landlords have, created some very slick pieces for welcoming tenants back to the building or for what they might be doing in the property. While we haven't probably gone that slick, we have prepared a welcome back brochure for our tenants to let them know what we've been doing while they're gone, and some ideas for them for things they can do when they come back into the space. We're also all focusing, just like tenants are, on education and social distancing. So, Gary, I don't know if you've been back to the building yet, but if you have, you will have seen what everybody in the world is doing, which is social distance markings on the floor. Obviously, that visual cue is really important for people because, how else do you know where 6 feet is? That's sort of an arbitrary number unless you have some visual cue to that. We are putting up banners in our lobbies that outline methods for you at a quick glance to see what you can do to minimize your risk, and to enhance your awareness. And featured prominently on that signage are big letters: "If you feel sick, go home." Setting elevator capacity limits. A lot of us are doing that. We're putting signage in the cars that say what is that limit, and then we are putting a mask on that sign. And we've got a couple different signs. One for the mask if it's required by the jurisdiction. If it's not required by the jurisdiction, we're recommending it. So I think we're all doing some of those similar things. We're all talking a lot about making as much of a touchless experience as possible. And, going completely touchless is probably not practical in every building, nor is it probably possible. Some landlords, and we've talked about it as well, are talking about destination dispatch for elevators. There are also a lot of, and I don't know if are you all familiar with destination dispatch?
Yes.
Okay. Not an inexpensive solution, but it is something that a lot of people are talking about more. It's kind of the slick new, what's coming in the world of elevators. There are a lot of apps out there that were out there pre-COVID that are still out there for access control. A lot of them are gaining more traction now. So the idea being that you would have an access app on your iPhone or cell phone and be able to scan that at different points in the building to get where you need to go. Some cybersecurity issues with some of them. Some buildings may require additional infrastructure. So a lot of people are, including us, are still in the process of exploring what type of apps we might be able to use and how practical those are for us. And then, of course, we're doing all the things that we can do easily. Hands-free faucets in the restrooms, flushometers, implementing visitor registration programs that are touchless. So we're thinking about all those things. We've actually done a lot of those things. We're also talking about for those areas where we can't go touchless, like your lobby doors can't always be touchless, leaving those open where it's feasible. If you're in an environment like San Francisco, for instance, where the weather's very temperate, you could leave the doors open to get some benefit of additional ventilation, but also people can just walk through without touching anything. Restrooms, and I know a lot of people will be doing this, because those doors really hard to make touchless. So we're putting trash cans right outside the restroom doors so people can grab a tissue on their way out the door, open the door, drop the tissue in the trash can, or frankly, they could take that tissue all the way through back to their desk and then dispose of it. And then elevators. This is a really big thing we're all talking about. It's how are we going to manage the potential line of employees coming in during the morning rush and leaving at the end of the day? And I don't think any of us really has a great answer for that yet, because we really haven't seen a huge influx of people into our properties yet. We are planning, and most of our tenants are probably not coming back till, maybe after July or August or even September, even though those stay-at-home orders have been lifted. So we're just monitoring the situation and monitoring those lines. And as we really start to see a more heavy influx of people, we'll station managers and security guards in the lobby and elevator mechanics, frankly, for the larger buildings, so that we can start to understand how the elevators are moving, and start to think about how we can be more efficient with that. So I think we're all talking about all those things. And back to the original point, there's definitely a lot of coordination with the tenants on these things.
So I have a question for you. So in a lot of commercial leases, as we all know, there's operating expense pass-throughs, and depending on the bargaining power of the tenant, you have, who's going to pay for capital improvements and whether it's going to be amortized or not. Are you seeing a lot of pushback or any pushback from tenants on the improvements you're making in the buildings?
No, not so far, because frankly, we really haven't made any huge capital improvements at this point. The elevator capacity, that's just a simple operational modification. And we've not gone to the point where we've implemented, as I mentioned, one of these apps. I think implementing those really requires a little bit more planning and probably more advanced time. I mean, 3 months sounds like a long time, but we haven't implemented anything like that yet. So no pushback at this point.
Yeah. Are you seeing buildings even start to get to the level of even half capacity? Or
no.
Yeah.
No, definitely not. So, we operate in a number of different markets across the country. Houston is probably the market where we definitely, even at the height of the pandemic, saw people still coming to the building. Every other market in the country, we probably went down to 0 or 5 or maybe 10% of the population in the building. Houston really hovered around 30%. So Houston's back up to about 40% right now. There's still, tenants are being thoughtful about how they reoccupy their space. And because a lot of these questions that you brought up, how do we work in our space if we're in a jurisdiction, for instance, that requires us to socially distance in our space? And that's a lot of tenants are going to have to make some changes in their space to, block out 6 feet, or, stagger people through their space. And the tenants are really still working through that process. So no, not a heavy influx yet, which we're a little surprised about.
As we all know, a lot of times in the leases, probably almost every commercial lease that has this provision where, with regard to tenants complying with laws within the premises or operating their space with, in compliance with laws. Are you reminding tenants, sending them notices of the executive orders or the guidelines?
Yeah, so we've been, and I'm probably going to divert now to janitorial just for a second, because Hannah, you mentioned cleaning and janitorial in your remarks, and we have been very actively engaged with our tenants throughout this pandemic, because once this started and we started changing our janitorial procedures and protocols, we had a fairly regular
I'm sorry, you probably hear my cat in the background. She's decided to go crazy all of a sudden. Yeah,
Joys of working from home.
She's got a toy in her mouth that she's carrying around like, I should pay attention to her. So.
I don't think this is going to be the only podcast where we have dogs and cats barking in the background.
Oh, it's hilarious. So anyway, so we were talking about janitorial, and when this pandemic started, we were communicating with our tenants on a very, very, very regular basis about what modifications we were making to our janitorial program. Starting with, more frequent cleaning of the high touch areas, using the chemicals that the EPA and CDC certified as effective in killing this virus. And so we were really communicating on a very regular basis. So our tenants did hear from us a lot, including what were the jurisdictional orders. We have not necessarily been updating our tenants on what the jurisdictional orders require. Most of our tenants have been monitoring those themselves, but as the orders change and as the stay-at-home orders have been lifted, we have definitely increased our communication with our tenants to understand what they're wanting to do relative to reoccupancy. So there's really been a very active dialogue back and forth. In fact, we have a tenant in our building in New York who occupies space at another property as well. And surprisingly, maybe a month and a half or so into this, told our property manager there that they hadn't heard anything from their other landlord, like nothing, radio silence, which stunned me. And they were very complimentary about the level of communication they've been getting. So, again, back to your point, we're kind of in it together. We need to be talking.
Yeah.
I think finally, Lisa, just one last question, and we really appreciate your time. What do you think is the most important takeaway for landlords and or tenants, just thinking about reopening and getting back into these buildings?
Well, I think takeaway number one is, we really do need to be patient with one another. We can all have, our beautifully laid out plans that we think are going to work wonderfully. But once we actually get in the building together and start seeing how those things work, we're going to have to make modifications, and we just need to be patient and flexible enough to be able to do that. And so we are reminding our tenants of that. So I think that's important. I think communicating is absolutely critical. Everybody needs to know what everybody else is doing, and that's not just tenants and landlords. I think that we need to communicate with our vendors. We need to continue to do that. And also within our larger real estate community. And as I said before, it's not who's doing it best. It's that we all have to work together to do this together. I think it's important to stay current with the situation as it evolves, understand what's changing, and be able to respond quickly to that. I think it's really important for owners and landlords to give property managers the tools and the support they need to put a plan in place and be able to respond timely and confidently. That property manager is the conduit between the landlord and the tenant, and they need to have that support in order to do their job comfortably and effectively. And I think industry outreach and relations, as I probably just said a minute ago, we all need to work together and share our ideas, if we want to be successful and get through this. And, I know we're all ready to move past it. It's been 3 months, but whoever would have imagined we'd be here, but we really do all need to help each other to get through it. And I think that the larger real estate community understands that. And I know at Shorenstein, we really have a very strong culture of customer service and relations. So we really understand how important it is to be actively engaged on that front.
That's incredibly helpful. And I think your points about flexibility and patience go way beyond real estate. It's something that we all have to remember right now. So very much appreciate the reminder.
Yes, absolutely.
We'll be continuing for the next couple months.
Thank you, Lisa, Hannah, and Gary, for joining us today to discuss these important issues. Thank you also to our listeners. For more information on the topics we discussed today or other real estate topics related to COVID-19, please visit the Pepper Hamilton Troutman Sanders COVID-19 Resource Center located at www.covid19.pepperlaw.com. And of course, if we can help you navigate any of the issues discussed during this podcast, please do not hesitate to contact any of our panelists. You can subscribe and listen to other Troutman Sanders and Pepper Hamilton podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts, including on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and stay safe.
These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Sanders does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal and other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Sanders.